Sego, hello friends. Welcome back today. We are reading the next section of chapter 17, and we will be finishing that today as well. One morning, Rolling Thunder had Spotted Eagle picking me up at camp and drive me down the mountain. Two young women, a German and a Dane, were visiting Rolling Thunder. They had come to the United States to gather material on the Native Americans and had done some work with the Committee of Concern for the Traditional Native in San Francisco, where we had met them. Rolling Thunder took us on an outing. We carried empty cartons and collected some plants, but with this group it became more of a social affair than the usual serious herb gathering. We headed southwest from Carlin toward the Eureka Highway and drove past the winding roads that led us up to our canyon. Rolling Thunder looked more to the side than the front as he drove, and when we came to a place that interested him, we stopped. Except for the major highway, US 80, roads in and out of Carlin are lightly traveled. This one here was the loneliest of all. Not a car passed while we were here. We carried our empty cartons perhaps 100 yards or so off the road. Now if you see a snake, don't do anything to hurt it, Rolling Thunder said as we started into the brush. We came to a huge juniper tree that was covered with blue-gray berries. Rolling Thunder needed some. He called them wild cedar berries. The two young women stared fixedly as the sacrifice was made, so this time I watched also. We were far from silent on this gathering. The two women chattered constantly in German and English as we picked the berries, and Rolling Thunder even answered some of their questions. But then he worked himself around to the downside hill of the enormous tree and became silent. The berries were tiny and the cardboard cartons large. At first we picked them one by one, but that way it would have taken until sundown to gather a cupful. We tried and discussed various ways of picking and decided the most efficient way was to hold the carton under a limb with one hand and run the other hand along the branches, knocking the berries off. This was rough on the hands, and it seemed a crude way to treat a medicine tree. I tried using only my fingertips, and while that was gentle, it was painstakingly slow. When we had just enough berries to barely cover the bottoms of the containers, Rolling Thunder walked around the tree with nearly a full box. I would not have said anything, but one of the Europeans asked, "How did you do that?" "Do what?" Rolling Thunder said, pouring our few berries into his container. Nothing more was said of the matter. Next we found wild sunflower plants, and Rolling Thunder wanted to get many leaves. Once again, this turned out to be nearly impossible for everyone except Rolling Thunder. He instructed us not to take any leaves occupied by even a single ant, and ants were everywhere. Rolling Thunder was pinching leaves with considerable speed, but we found ourselves slowly and carefully examining every leaf. I tried pushing ants along with the tip of my finger, but they refused to cooperate. If one ran down the stem, two others took its place, or they simply froze, daring me to flick them off in front of Rolling Thunder, custodian of the land, and perhaps of the ants as well. I watched Rolling Thunder and saw that he is simply wiggling his fingers above the leaves with a sort of herding motion, while the ants scurried away. He did it again and again. Each time he waved at a leaf, the ants would depart en masse. I saw him point his finger down a stem and move a column of ants as though his finger were a magnet, and the ants little particles of iron. I wanted to try this myself, but not where Rolling Thunder could see. I had just started towards another sunflower when I saw a rattlesnake. My mouth and eyes sprung open. The snake began to slide, and the rattle almost brushed against my boot. I was about to become either paralyzed or jet-propelled, but instead, I became oddly elated. Every time I had been with Rolling Thunder up on the hill, down a river, into the bushes, or along a road, he had spoken a few protective words in behalf of his respected snakes. Now, here at last, one was. I believe I might have smiled at the snake and then at Rolling Thunder. "Look at this," I said. Everyone turned. Even the women were calm. Rolling Thunder knelt down close to the head of the snake and held out his hand. The snake coiled and raised its head to meet the hand. His hand and the snake's eyes were only inches apart. They both began to move. When the hand withdrew, the head went back. And when the head went back, the head followed. Rolling Thunder bobbed his head and the rattles buzzed. Now he extended both his hands and the snake swayed slowly between them, first to one side, then to the other. Rolling Thunder and the snake were eye to eye, and I watched, suspended. It was a dance. Rolling Thunder stopped and the snake became still, absolutely motionless. "Now," he said, "watch him go about his business." He wheeled around on one foot and stood up with his back to the snake. The snake went limp, uncoiled, and slid through a drain pipe under the highway and was gone. No one said a word. Many times Rolling Thunder had seen animals before they became visible. Even the little black stink bug had been where it was needed. I had watched Rolling Thunder in dialogue with mosquitoes, ants, and now a snake. I believe that when he needed any animal, it would be waiting. Rolling Thunder had his own understanding of these things, but I would have to account for the facts myself. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce once said, "The earth and myself are of one mind." Rolling Thunder had said that the earth is an organism, one body of one being. I sensed that Rolling Thunder and the deer, snakes, bees, mosquitoes, ants, and pinyon trees were one being. And if that were so, then all of us were this one being, including my colleagues at the Menninger Foundation, who could never accept such questionable rubbish. This kind of knowledge might be admissible in church, depending on the church, but it is not yet a noticeable part of mental health research or therapy. Rolling Thunder often wondered out loud why psychiatrists failed to see the causal relationship between mental illness, air and water pollution, and the destruction of forests. Every traditional native could see this relationship, this man-mind-nature interaction. Perhaps this is why Native Americans are still performing impossible agricultural and medical feats, why Native Americans are still custodians of the land. The four of us drove to the campsite and shared a meal in the sunset. I brought up the pinyon tree chaining. Oscar Johnny says they did some chaining south of here just a few days ago. Rolling Thunder responded, "I had a feeling that was going to happen." Richard Clemmer was in the Bureau of Land Management office several times. They promised to let him know as soon as the next chaining was scheduled. "I know," I said. "Richard got a card in the mail from the Bureau of Land Management yesterday telling him that nothing was happening, but that they would keep in touch. I saw the card myself." "They probably wrote that just as the chaining was finished," Rolling Thunder said. "They're pretty sneaky people. They know what they're doing is wrong, and that's why they have to lie. They can't afford to let anybody see their destruction. Not an anthropology student, or a land management student, or anybody else. Of course, they put out their own propaganda on it, and they probably don't want anyone to pick up on any conflicting facts. Well, next time they do it, we'll be right there with them, and with cameras." The following day, Anne and Richard returned from a Shoshone festival in Ruby Valley, and I told them what Rolling Thunder had said about the chaining. They knew the chaining had occurred because they had talked with Oscar Johnny in Ruby Valley. Richard wondered how we were to record the next episode. He doubted that the Bureau of Land Management would ever get advice of the warning. Another several hundred acres were sure to be attacked within the next week or two. It was time for the first frost, the time when, for centuries, the cones have opened on the trees and yielded their life-sustaining food. It was the time the Bureau of Land Management usually chose for the heaviest destruction of the forests. On the first day of September, I got my 12-herb hay fever capsules from Spotted Fawn. I took 2 capsules 3 times a day. When the capsules were gone, so was my hay fever. There has been no trace of it since. The herbs worked differently from the drugstore chemicals I had been taking. There was none of that fuzzy, drugged feeling I experienced about 10 or 15 minutes after taking every pill. The effects of the herbs were gradual. On the first day, I felt no effect at all. By the end of the third day, however, all the symptoms were gone. To be safe, I continued the dosage until my supply ran out. Spotted Fawn asked if I wanted more capsules, but there was no need for them. The herb capsules were never tested under the most strenuous conditions, I'll admit. On September 3rd, a policeman arrived at our camp at the crack of dawn, getting us out of bed and claiming that he had been instructed to have us leave. He said that with the freezing weather coming on, our site would become a pretty great fire risk. First, we moved into Rolling Thunder's house trailer, and 2 days later, we moved into a rooming house on Hamilton Street. I had few regrets about breaking camp for the winter, but I would have liked demonstrating that my hay fever could never have returned, even in the canyon. In any case, the 12 herbs, the policeman, the climate, and the dry grass around our campsite were all real enough, but the effects of all these things upon me had to be of my own making. Weeks passed and we heard nothing about the chaining projects. One day in early November, in Goshuet country south of Ellie, in the scenic Weaver Creek area near Sacramento Pass, the destruction began again, and we were there with our cameras. In mid-September, I had gone with Ann and Richard to spend a few weeks back in Topeka, Kansas. While I worked at the Menninger Foundation, Ann and Richard made a trip out to Hopi Land and back. In October, we drove back to Carlin. There were no reports of chaining while we were gone, but we knew that if more land was to be cleared this year, it would have to be done soon. This was the season when, years ago, whole Shoshone clans would be out in the forests. They would be in temporary villages for the pinyon nut harvest. We waited until the end of October, wondering whether the bulldozers and the chains were at work without our knowing it. On the first day of November, Richard took off in his dirty white Ford to scout the state, if necessary. If any chaining was being done, he wanted to find it. He was gone for several days. Ann and I began to worry. We were safe in our rooms, but the thought of Richard lost, out of gas or marooned in the hills on these freezing nights, was an uncomfortable one. "He's okay," Rolling Thunder told us. "I have a feeling he's about onto something." Richard returned with urgent news. They were at work. Hundreds of acres down south. The trees were going fast. We would have to hurry. Richard himself had been fine, sleeping in his car at night and spending the daylight hours searching. I was about 200 miles from Carlin and about to give up when I thought I heard the Caterpillar tractors far up in the hills. I drove in close as I could and listened again. It was a chaining crew on the other side of the hill. I walked an hour through the trees and I found them. 3 tractors pulling a gigantic anchor chain. Those trees were being ripped up at an incredible speed. Richard pinpointed the area on Rolling Thunder's maps and urged that we leave as soon as possible. Early the next morning, we packed sandwiches and picked up Rolling Thunder. The Danish woman, who had extended her visit in Carlin, joined us with her camera. There were 5 of us and 5 cameras. Rolling Thunder had an 8mm movie camera, and he examined it several times, hoping, I suppose, that he would be able to make it perform. By the time we reached Ellie, about halfway we were hungry, and mentioned the food we'd packed. I think I'll stop in a little place down here I know, Rolling Thunder said. I haven't really had breakfast yet. Got up too late and left too early. I like to kind of start off with a good breakfast. Then too, I have a special stomach, and I have to pretty much watch what I eat. Although I do know you make fine sandwiches. We went inside with Rolling Thunder while he ordered fried eggs over easy, hash brown potatoes, country sausage, toast, jelly, and a stack of hotcakes, and asked the waitress if she could leave just a couple slices of raw onion and leave the coffee pot right on the table beside his cup. This was Rolling Thunder's special diet. We glanced at each other and smiled. Rolling Thunder knew what he was doing. The first thing any of us would agree on about Rolling Thunder is that he understands himself. It was afternoon by the time Richard drove up into the hills to the point where he had reached the day before. We loaded our cameras and started off to the sound of the tractors. Richard thought they sounded much farther away now. We walked a long way, but the sound stayed in the distance ahead. They were working away from us. We tried to increase our speed, but the going was difficult because we had to walk through felled and shattered trees. The pungent pine odors and the snapping around the trees being ripped to the ground reached us from the valley below. We broke into a run and soon found ourselves behind the chain, stumbling over the ripped trees, struggling to keep up and pointing our cameras like weapons. It was an incredible scene. Pinyon trees falling by the hundreds. Dust and debris flew into our faces, and our camera lenses had to be dusted off between every shot. The roar of the engines and the snapping and cracking of the trees made so much noise that we could not talk to each other. All we could do was keep as close as possible to the chain and try to capture the tragedy all around us. Suddenly, the tractor stopped, and the silence was startling. We were all covered with dust, chunks of dirt, and splinters of wood. When we looked back, there were dead, sprawling, twisted trees as far as we could see. The huge chain had come to a rest against the trunks of those trees next to go. I wondered whether in the consciousness of these trees there was a sense of bewilderment or terror. The pinyon trees were not as majestic as the redwoods, but they had grace and beauty. To the Shoshone natives, they offered more nutrition per acre than anything else, plant or animal, that could be raised in this area. Look at these trees, Rolling Thunder said. Some of the elders here are over 500 years old. One of the tractor operators stepped down from his bulldozer and crawled over the chain. The chaining was over for the day. We talked with him for a moment and then left. Our conversation had been friendly, and the operator's curiosity about us had given us a chance to talk about their schedule. We wanted to know how many days more they would be chaining and where they would be going next. They were a lot nicer than I expected, someone said. Well, they try to be friendly, Rolling Thunder replied. You can't blame them too much, they're just working people, because they don't know what they're doing. They got a contract and they're doing the job. They have no idea about the long-term implications of this destruction, no idea whatsoever. The guilt is with the Bureau of Land Management and the government. The blame belongs up here with the power and the greed. The contractors needed 2 more days in this area, so we planned to come back. This would mean staying overnight and buying meals. Funds were a problem. Rolling Thunder's brakeman salary supported his family as well as his work. I had my salary from the Manager Foundation, but I was providing my travel expenses. Anne and Richard were coming to the end of the savings set aside for Richard's thesis. Rolling Thunder remarked how absurd it was that people should have to scrape for nickels and dimes to sustain them through the effort to save trees from millionaire ranchers. Some of our medicine people could work on another level and probably block this chaining of the trees, but the problem would still be there. All the ignorance and all the greed, or we would fall into a great spiritual contest. It's the most reasonable for us to work in a very practical way, on a human level. We found inexpensive rooms in an old hotel in Ellie. The rooms were all the same, sagging mattresses on old iron beds, and the bathroom was down the hall. After supper, Rolling Thunder picked up nearly a dozen old magazines from a table in the hall and took them into his room. Anne and Richard joined me for a game of cards, sitting cross-legged on the bed. Since Rolling Thunder had retired with all the magazines, we decided we could play for at least an hour. In the middle of one of our games, I began to laugh. I just flashed on the picture of Rolling Thunder standing up there on that hill, holding his little 8mm camera, telling the cat driver we were from a camera club from all the way over in the city. He must have thought Rolling Thunder was the president, with feathers in his hat. In the morning, we checked out and had breakfast and drove back over Sacramento Pass. It was midday by the time we reached the tractors. The men stopped and offered to let someone ride to take pictures. Richard climbed on in with Rolling Thunder's movie camera, but the Caterpillar tractor bounced and vibrated so much that Richard couldn't even hold the camera to his face, much less keep it steady. Richard asked the operator to stop. When the tractor started again, we tried to follow, stopping now and again to reload and then racing to keep up. The uprooting was done in a series of rows, and the caterpillars turned again and again, working back and forth down the side of the hill, across a narrow valley and up the next hill. At times, we stood among trees that were about to be uprooted to get shots of the approaching chain. It was dangerous business. It was difficult to keep from tripping over fallen limbs and branches or slipping in patches of snow. There were 3 tractors about 50 yards apart, and the drivers could not see us when we were between them. There was always a chance of getting crushed or spiked by the chain. Soon the sun started getting low, and the tractors kept going around the side of a hill and down into another valley. We ran after them, but soon gave up, exhausted. Rolling Thunder gathered some native tea and other herbs, tied them all into a bundle, and walked down to the foot of the hill to deposit the bundle near the road. Then he walked back up to the hill where we were resting. "They've taken everything," he said. "Killed every bit of life here. Trees, native tea, sacred herbs, everything." We began to walk, and we followed Rolling Thunder. We were not going in the direction of the car. We were just walking. He picked up a few plants as we went along and then stopped to let us take pictures of him, standing beside a felled tree whose roots reached over his head. He stood motionless by the dying tree for a few moments, then he lit his pipe. The 4 of us stood quietly. He made a simple sacrifice and talked in a quiet way to the Great Spirit. The late evening air was crisp and chilling. The setting sun colored the clouds. The Great Spirit was in the clouds, we had been told, and also in the trees, the nuts, the native tea, the air in our lungs, and the dirt on our faces. The meaning of Rolling Thunder's prayer was that the government of the United States was grotesque and overbearing, and that with all its dangerously powerful bureaus, it was causing disharmony and destruction all over the planet by manipulation, by meddling in the affairs of natives, the affairs of other Americans, the affairs of the Vietnamese and Cambodians, and the affairs of the pinyon trees. To him, the matter was spiritual and not political. He spoke in a gentle manner. He asked that this pinyon tree chaining be seen by those who needed most to see it as a symbol of the misuse of power. We asked that the chaining be stopped, and that the trees be allowed to grow again wherever they had been, and that their safe return symbolized the sovereign right of all species, of all kingdoms, to live in their own nature. Then he spoke to the trees, as if he felt a need to say something, to say some words for them, to them. I looked at him against the background of the thousand of dying trees that covered the hills behind. He had not only come to engage in a futile struggle against the destruction, he had come to be with the trees, and now his thoughts were with them. His voice became muted, and I could perceive a tightness in his throat. He spoke slowly, almost stuttering. And we ask that the trees be allowed to return, to grow again in this place where they belong. And that until that day, there be peace presiding over this land. We ask that the shock of this tragedy, that this confusion and fear. His voice trailed off. We began to scan the hills on either side, but then he looked into the sky and was stone still. I could hear him breathing. This was too painful a sight for a custodian of the land. A very powerful end to a very important chapter. We'll be back again very soon, my friends. Niawa. Take care.